Bethins to Poland, September 1939. The morning mist still clings to the fields outside Warsaw when the first panzer column rolls into view. 7 tanks, black crosses stark against grey steel, engines rumbling like distant thunder. The Wehrmacht's finest, battle-hardened from the Spanish Civil War, equipped with the machines that are currently rewriting the rules of modern warfare. They advance in textbook formation, commanders scanning for anti-tank positions, infantry moving in support. They have no idea they are being stalked by a ghost with nothing but glass bottles and a farmer's cunning. A lone figure crouches in a drainage ditch beside the road. Not a soldier. Not yet. Just a man who 3 weeks ago was harvesting potatoes, but in his calloused hands are 7 bottles filled with petrol and oil. Cloth wicks stuffed in their necks, he watches the tanks approach with the same patience he once used waiting for deer to emerge from the forest at dawn. The lead panzer draws closer. 50 meters. 40. The tank commander hasn't spotted him yet. Why would he? What threat could one man possibly pose to 7 tons of armored steel? The figure is Ignacy Gazda, though his name won't appear in any official records for decades. By day's end, he will have achieved something that will be whispered about in Wehrmacht officers' tents with a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. He will destroy 7 German tanks in a single morning using a tactic so absurd, so impossibly brazen, that it should never have worked. And yet his achievement will stand in Polish military folklore as one of the most audacious individual actions of the entire invasion. The question that haunts military historians even now is simple. How did an illiterate farmer with homemade explosives accomplish what entire anti-tank companies failed to do? 3 weeks earlier, Ignacy Gazda was nobody in particular. Born in 1899 in the village of Wehrmacht, barely a crossroads on the map 30 kilometers south of Warsaw, he had spent his entire 40 years working the same plot of land his father and grandfather had worked. He couldn't read, he could barely write his own name. But he could track a fox through winter woods by the faintest disturbance in the snow, and he could judge the wind's speed and direction by watching how smoke rose from his chimney, skills that seemed utterly useless in the mechanized age of 1939. When Germany invaded on the 1st of September, Gazda's world ended in the span of a morning. The Luftwaffe came first, Stuka screaming down to destroy the bridges and rail junctions. Then came the tanks, the magnificent and terrible panzers that Wehrmacht propaganda films had been showcasing for months. The Polish army, still largely dependent on horse cavalry and Great War-era artillery, found itself catastrophically outmatched. Gazda watched from the tree line as Polish lancers charged German tanks near Mokra. He watched brave men die because their weapons belonged to a previous era. Something cold and calculating crystallized in his chest. If his country's army couldn't stop the invasion, perhaps one farmer could at least slow it down. He reported to the local army recruitment station in the village of Guerrilla. The sergeant who interviewed him took one look at this weathered, middle-aged peasant and nearly dismissed him outright. Too old. No military experience. Illiterate. But something in Gazda's eyes made the sergeant pause. There was a stillness there, a predator's patience. The sergeant had seen that look before in his best scouts. He asked Gazda what he could do. Gazda's answer was simple: I can hunt. They assigned him to an improvised resistance group, barely official, consisting of local men who knew the terrain. No uniforms, no ranks, no heavy weapons. What they had were rifles, a few grenades, and crates of vodka bottles that someone suggested could be turned into incendiary devices. A priest from Warsaw, who'd read about the Spanish Civil War, explained the concept: fill bottles with petrol, add a thickening agent like oil or soap, stuff a fuel-soaked rag in the neck, throw it at a tank's engine compartment. The Spanish Republicans had called them Molotov cocktails after the Soviet foreign minister. A dark joke about Soviet bombs disguised as food aid during the Winter War with Finland. Gazda listened to the explanation once. Then he disappeared into his barn for 2 days. When he emerged, he had refined the design. He'd discovered that adding pine pitch and strips of rubber from old tires created a mixture that stuck to metal and burned hotter than petrol alone. He'd realized that the rag needed to be soaked not just in petrol, but in a mixture that would ignite instantly on impact. Most importantly, he'd solved the fundamental problem of Molotov cocktails. How do you get close enough to throw one at a moving tank without being shot to pieces by supporting infantry? His solution was so ridiculous that when he explained it to the sergeant, the man actually laughed. Then he saw Gazda's face and realized the farmer was completely serious. The German attack came on the morning of September 16th. Gazda had been tracking this particular panzer column for 2 days, moving parallel to them through the forests and fields, watching their patterns. He'd noticed something crucial. The tank commanders kept their hatches open whilst advancing through apparently clear terrain. They needed visibility. The closed vision slits on the Panzer I and II models were notoriously inadequate, and the tanks advanced with confidence through farmland, their commanders convinced that any real anti-tank threat would be positioned at bridges or crossroads, not in random agricultural fields. Gazda had chosen his killing ground with a hunter's eye for terrain. A straight section of road with drainage ditches on both sides, deep enough to hide a man, but not wide enough to stop a tank. Dense hedgerows blocking easy retreat. Most importantly, a slight rise in the road that would force the tanks to slow as they crested it. He positioned himself in the ditch, 50 meters from the rise, covered in mud and grass, utterly still. The first Panzer, a Panzer II light tank, crested the rise at approximately 7:30 in the morning. The commander stood in his cupola, scanning ahead, expecting nothing. Gazda waited. He'd learned patience from countless freezing mornings, waiting for deer. The tank passed within 10 meters of his position, close enough to smell the exhaust fumes and hear the crew talking inside. Still, he waited. Then he did something that should have gotten him killed immediately. He stood up, in full view of the German infantry, following the tanks, and he ran, not away from the Panzer, but parallel to the road, visible to everyone, sprinting like a panicked civilian. The German infantry did exactly what he'd calculated they would do. They raised their rifles. They shouted warnings. The tank commander swiveled his machine gun, and Gazda dropped into the opposite drainage ditch, vanishing as if the earth had swallowed him. The Germans were now focused on the spot where he disappeared, infantry moving forward cautiously, the tank's turret traversing to cover the ditch. None of them were watching the original ditch where Gazda had been hiding. None of them saw the second figure rise from that position, walk calmly to the road, and place something directly behind the Panzer II. Because there was no second figure, Gazda had prepared his decoy the previous night, a stuffed bundle of clothes arranged to look like a man lying in ambush, positioned in the opposite ditch. When he'd run across the road, he'd drawn every eye toward that false position, and whilst they were focused there, he'd circled back using the dead ground of the drainage ditch and approached the tank from behind. The Molotov cocktail he placed beneath the engine compartment was already lit. He didn't throw it. He positioned it like a farmer setting a jug of water beside a fence post. Then he dropped back into the ditch and began crawling away. The explosion was smaller than one might expect from films. No massive fireball, just a sudden eruption of flame enveloping the Panzer's rear deck. But the superheated mixture found its way into the engine compartment's ventilation. The tank lurched to a halt, black smoke pouring from the grills. The crew bailed out, coughing and cursing. The tank was dead. The German infantry were still searching the wrong ditch. The remaining 6 tanks had stopped. Commanders now closed inside their turrets, buttoned up and blind, except for narrow vision slits. They were stationary targets, and Gazda had 6 more bottles. What happened over the next 40 minutes defies tactical logic. Gazda repeated his trick, with variations, 6 more times. Sometimes he threw rocks into one ditch whilst approaching from another. Sometimes he lit small fires in the fields to create smoke and confusion. Once he simply stood up and waved at a tank like he was surrendering. Then dropped into the ditch as machine gun fire churned the ground where he'd stood. Whilst the Germans focused on that spot, he crawled underneath a hedgerow and approached a different tank entirely. The German infantry grew increasingly paranoid, firing at shadows and empty ditches. The tank commanders refused to open their hatches, but this meant they couldn't see properly, couldn't coordinate with their infantry, couldn't spot the farmer who moved through their formation like smoke through fingers. Each time Gazda placed, rather than threw, his Molotov cocktails, he understood that accuracy mattered more than distance. A bottle thrown from 15 meters might miss or bounce off armor. A bottle placed precisely beneath the engine grill would find its way inside. By 9 o'clock in the morning, 7 panzers sat burning or disabled along that single stretch of road. The remaining German infantry had withdrawn in confusion. Their radio reports were contradictory and panicked. Ambush by anti-tank company, possible minefield, coordinated partisan attack. Not one report mentioned a single farmer with homemade bombs. Gazda walked home through the forests. He stopped at a stream to wash the soot from his face and hands. By noon, he was back in his barn, milking his cow as if nothing had happened. He told no one. When Wehrmacht investigators arrived 2 days later, searching for the partisan cell that had destroyed their tanks, they found only an empty road and some charred metal, and the elderly farmer they questioned claimed he'd been in his cellar during the attack, had seen nothing, knew nothing. They believed him. Why wouldn't they? He was just an ignorant peasant. The Wehrmacht's after-action reports from that engagement revealed their complete failure to understand what had happened. They concluded they'd encountered a well-coordinated anti-tank team using Spanish Civil War tactics, possibly Soviet-trained saboteurs. They recommended that panzer columns advance with increased infantry screening and that commanders keep hatches closed in contested areas. They never imagined it was one man with 7 bottles. Gazda's achievement was brutally simple in conception, but required extraordinary execution. His tactics revealed several revolutionary insights that wouldn't become standard doctrine until much later in the war. First, the importance of decoys and misdirection in defeating combined arms formations. Second, the vulnerability of armored vehicles when separated from proper infantry support. Third, the effectiveness of placing rather than throwing small explosives for maximum accuracy. Fourth, the psychological impact of an enemy who refused to behave according to expected patterns. Most radically, Gazda had intuited something that would take military theorists years to articulate. In the age of mechanized warfare, the individual soldier armed with portable explosives had become potentially more dangerous than traditional anti-tank guns. His Molotov cocktails cost pennies to produce. The panzers he destroyed were worth thousands of Reichsmarks each. It was asymmetric warfare decades before the term existed. Polish resistance forces eventually heard rumors about the Węgrzynów attack. They sent representatives to investigate. Gazda showed them his remaining Molotov cocktails and explained his decoy tactics. They were astounded. Here was a military innovation, born not from doctrine or training, but from pure necessity and hunting instinct. They wanted to recruit him immediately, train more fighters in his methods, turn him into an instructor. Gazda refused. He was a farmer, not a soldier. He'd done what needed doing that one morning because German tanks were rolling through his fields. Now, they'd learned to be more cautious. The trick wouldn't work twice. He was quite matter-of-fact about this assessment. His understanding of tactics was intuitive rather than intellectual. He knew his success had depended entirely on surprise and the Germans' assumption that they faced conventional opposition. Neither advantage could be recreated. The Polish resistance convinced him to at least demonstrate his techniques. For 2 weeks, in October 1939, before the German occupation fully solidified, Gazda trained small groups of resistance fighters in what became known as the farmer's method. He taught them about decoys and misdirection, about patience and stillness, about thinking like a hunter rather than a soldier. Most importantly, he taught them that weapons don't win fights, Understanding your enemy's expectations and violating them wins fights. His students went on to use variations of his tactics throughout occupied Poland. The Wehrmacht never entirely solved the problem of Molotov cocktails deployed by partisans who understood deception. But Gazda himself never fought again. He returned to his farm and disappeared back into obscurity. The end came for Ignacy Gazda, not on any battlefield, but in the brutal aftermath of Poland's destruction. In 1940, the NKVD arrested him during the Soviet occupation of eastern Poland. The Soviets had learned about his training activities from informants. They didn't see a Polish patriot who destroyed German tanks. They saw a potential resistance leader who might one day turn his talents against Soviet occupiers. He was transported to a labor camp in Siberia on charges of anti-Soviet activities. The charges were technically accurate. He had trained fighters who opposed Soviet forces, but the irony was savage. The man who'd humiliated the Wehrmacht was condemned by Germany's then allies. Gazda died in the winter of 1942 in the Kolyma labor camp. He was 43 years old. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but that was merely the medical term for what happened when malnutrition, exhaustion, and sub-zero temperatures combined to extinguish a human life. He was buried in an unmarked mass grave with dozens of other prisoners. No ceremony, no recognition, no record beyond a single line in a camp ledger. The bitter irony extends further still. Gazda's decoy tactics eventually became foundational to resistance warfare throughout occupied Europe. British SOE operatives studied reports of the Wehrmacht attack and incorporated similar misdirection techniques into their training. Soviet partisans used variations of his Molotov placement methods. American forces in the Pacific discovered that Marines armed with thermite grenades could disable Japanese tanks using almost identical stalking and decoy approaches. The farmer's method spread through underground channels and military intelligence networks. By 1944, every resistance fighter in Europe knew some version of the tactics Gazda had invented from pure necessity. But Gazda himself knew none of this. He died believing he'd fought one morning's battle and trained a few men who'd probably been captured or killed. He had no concept that his innovations were being analyzed in London and Moscow, taught in clandestine training camps, studied by professional soldiers. He thought of himself as a farmer who'd killed some tanks because they were in his fields. Nothing more. Polish military historians didn't piece together Gazda's story until the 1970s, when surviving resistance members began sharing their wartime experiences more openly. Even then, the details emerged slowly, contradictory, filtered through decades of memory and propaganda. Some accounts claimed he destroyed 10 tanks, others said 5. Some described elaborate resistance networks. Others insisted he acted entirely alone. The truth emerged from Wehrmacht records, cross-referenced with Polish resistance reports and survivor testimonies. 1 man, 7 tanks, 1 morning, September 1939. No monument marks the spot where Gazda fought. The road outside Węgrzynów has been paved over multiple times. The drainage ditches are long gone, replaced by modern culverts. The hedgerows were cleared decades ago for more efficient farming. Nothing remains except the Wehrmacht after-action reports filed away in German military archives, dry bureaucratic documents that inadvertently preserve the outline of what one farmer accomplished. The tactical legacy extends beyond Molotov cocktails. Gazda's intuitive understanding of asymmetric warfare, that a weaker force could defeat a stronger one through deception, surprise, and exploiting the enemy's assumptions, became fundamental to resistance doctrine worldwide. His insight that placement beats throwing, that stillness beats movement, that appearing where you're not expected beats appearing where you're expected. These principles seem obvious now. In 1939, they were revolutionary. Modern military analysts studying the action note several factors that made Gazda's success possible. His hunting background gave him exceptional patience and observational skills. His knowledge of the terrain allowed him to move unseen through areas the Germans assumed were open. His illiteracy meant he approached problems through direct observation rather than doctrine. He wasn't constrained by how things should be done, because he didn't know how things should be done. He simply invented solutions based on what he could see in front of him. The psychological dimension was equally crucial. The German tank crews had been trained to expect anti-tank guns positioned at strong points, infantry with anti-tank rifles in prepared positions, perhaps mines on major routes. They had no mental model for a lone fighter using decoys and stalking tactics. When their tanks began exploding, their officers concluded they'd encountered a sophisticated ambush because they couldn't conceive that one man with primitive weapons could achieve such results. Gazda's greatest weapon was the enemy's inability to imagine him. Post-war studies of successful partisan actions consistently identify similar patterns: small forces using intimate terrain knowledge, simple weapons precisely applied, and tactics that violated enemy expectations. Gazda's Morning of Combat became a case study in how individual initiative and improvisation could achieve results far beyond what the combatants' equipment suggested was possible. Military academies, from West Point to Sandhurst, eventually taught variations of his decoy techniques, though few instructors knew the origin story. The record stands now for 85 years, 7 tanks, destroyed by one man in one morning using improvised explosives and hunting tactics. It will never be broken, not because future fighters lack courage or skill, but because the conditions that made it possible no longer exist. Modern tanks have thermal sights that would detect a hidden fighter's body heat. Infantry carry radios that allow instant coordination. Aerial reconnaissance would spot decoys. Doctrine has evolved specifically to prevent the kind of close approach Gazda achieved. The era that created his opportunity ended within months of his achievement, as all armies absorbed the lessons of Poland and adapted. But numbers failed to capture the essential truth. Gazda saved lives that morning. The 7 tanks he destroyed would have gone on to kill Polish soldiers and civilians. The delay he created, forcing the German column to halt and regroup, allowed refugees to evacuate. His demonstration that the Wehrmacht was not invincible provided desperate hope to a conquered nation, and his tactics, spread through resistance networks, gave thousands of fighters tools to resist occupation. In the small museum in Węgrzynów, there's a single display case dedicated to Ignacy Gazda. It contains a photograph, the only known image of him, taken at a village festival in 1937, showing a weathered man with careful eyes. Beside it are reproductions of the Wehrmacht reports describing the partisan ambush outside the village. And there's one authentic artifact, a vodka bottle from the 1930s, the same type he would have used, positioned on a small pedestal with a brass plaque explaining what one farmer accomplished with 7 such bottles. The final line of the plaque reads simply, "He was a hunter who found himself in a war. For one morning, that was enough." It's inadequate. Any summary would be. How do you reduce a man's entire existence to a single morning's violence? How do you explain that the same hands that planted potatoes and milked cows also destroyed 7 vehicles of industrial warfare? How do you reconcile the quiet farmer who returned to his barn afterwards with the tactical genius who invented methods that would influence resistance warfare worldwide? Perhaps you don't. Perhaps you simply state the facts. Ignacy Gazda, born 1899, died 1942, farmer, hunter. For one morning in September 1939, he became something else entirely. 7 German tanks learned what happens when modern machinery encounters primitive cunning married to absolute courage. The lesson cost them everything. It cost Gazda only a single morning. And then he went back to being who he'd always been, a man who understood patience, terrain, and the moment to strike, until history and tyranny caught up with him in a frozen labor camp thousands of kilometers from home. The fields outside Węgrzynów grow wheat now, golden in summer, peaceful in the morning light. Nothing marks where the tanks burned except perhaps the soil itself, enriched decades ago by the ashes of Germany's mechanized pride, destroyed by a man who couldn't read but who could hunt like no one else alive.